China is Canada's second largest trading partner after the United States and has not previously shied away from expanding diplomatic rows with various countries on the trade front. Canadian businesses, especially in the agriculture sector, got a taste of that after the arrest of a Chinese Zhao Wei executive in Canada 5 years ago. And after Canada expelled a Chinese diplomat this week, alleging interference in domestic politics, China quickly retaliated with a similar action. Could this again impact Canadian businesses? Our next guest has had an inside view of dealing with China as a former Canadian ambassador to that country. Guy Saint-Jacques joins us now. Thanks so much for making time today.
Thank you for the invitation.
So Canada has, been careful to not appear hostile to China, and it seems like leading up to this decision to expel this Chinese diplomat, it was trying to weigh the potential consequences of doing so. How do you view the decision that was made by the Canadian government?
Well, I think it was totally appropriate. It would have been difficult to take a different one after everything that we learned in the last week, I would say. And I think that probably a choice was offered to China when Deputy Minister Morrison met with the Chinese ambassador Zhao Wei last Thursday. He must have shown him the file that CSIS has on Mr. Zhao Wei. And on that basis, I must have told the ambassador, if I were you, I would recall Mr. Zhao right away, and I'll give you a couple of days to think about it. And if you don't recall him, we will expel him. And of course, now that China and Chinese diplomats run a much more aggressive diplomacy, they wanted to force the hand of Canada, and Canada had no choice but to expel Mr. Zhao. This being said, I think that the response of China has been a very measured one, because they could have chosen to escalate the situation by expelling more than one diplomat or expelling someone more senior than Mrs. Lalonde. At the end, they chose someone who was at about the same level as Mr. Zhao. Of course, they said that there could be further measures, but clearly for them, they wanted to contain the situation and avoid an escalation at this stage.
Yeah, in your experience, how does China sort of calibrate a response in this situation? That sounds like you're a bit, surprised perhaps, or that, that this was just, sort of we expelled one and they expelled one.
Well, I know that a number of Canadians are wondering whether, they will arrest or detain Canadians living in China. Mm-hmm. And my answer to this is, in fact, they do this only when we arrest someone here in Canada that is of interest to China. This was the case of Mrs. Meng Wanzhou that you mentioned in your introduction earlier. Mm-hmm. This is different. And China knows very well that they have had a free and for many years to run all kinds of interference activities in Canada. Furthermore, in terms of economic sanctions, China is still going through a difficult economic situation. They are faced with foreign companies that are reducing operations in China or in some cases relocating to third countries. President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Qiang have embarked on a charm offensive to convince companies to come back to China, to invest in China, that they will be well treated. Having hit Canada with further economic sanctions would have sent a very wrong message, not only to Canadian business people, but to business people in the Western world. Add to this a new anti-espionage law that has been adopted by China, which is creating a lot of anxiety among foreigners living in China, because the definition of national security is so wide. So I think for all those reasons, the ball is back in the Canadian camp, and China will wait to see what next step Canada will take. But at the end also, I think it pays to be firmer with China, especially also with our allies, who must have been wondering what will it take for Canada to take action.
So do you think that this won't necessarily escalate from here then, Guy?
Yeah, I think at this stage, I don't expect an escalation. I think in terms of, we'll have to wait for developments in Canada, and the the next deadline is the report by the former Governor General David Johnston on May 23rd, who will say whether, in his view, a public inquiry is required. I think he will come to that conclusion, and so that we can find out why there was not more action taken when all those events occurred. Because when CSIS sent its report up to the National Security Advisor in the summer of 2021, we were in a full-blown crisis with China. After the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, the two Michaels were still there. We knew we had been penalized. We had lost billions of dollars in exports. The relations were tough, and a red light should have gone on right after it was learned that what they were doing to the family of Michael Chung. And so I think an inquiry would help to understand if we are talking here of a systemic failure, or someone, maybe a minister or someone in the Prime Minister's office that didn't do his job. But in any case, I think it falls now on the Canadian government to take actions within its jurisdiction to better protect Canadians, and special efforts have to be made also to protect Canadians of Chinese origin if they are intimidated or harassed and they want to report. They have to be convinced that there will be a proper follow-up that will be given.
Guy, is there a risk, though, of of moving too hastily? If there was some sort of a report, but the government didn't feel like it had full control over the situation, and that it knew that it was in fact what some of the evidence was sort of pointing to, and making a decision that might ruffle some feathers when it comes to China.
Well, they knew that there would be a reaction, but I think, after this report came out about a week ago, I think that, and probably what people started to do is to look at all the evidence that had been assembled by CSIS on this diplomat, and I'm pretty sure this was a pretty thick file. This is why I was saying earlier that probably Ambassador Tsong was told, look, what we know about your guy, and it would be time for him to go back to China. We went through a similar case in 2009 or 2010, and at the time, the Chinese ambassador, when he saw all the evidence, decided that it was time for the Chinese diplomat to simply go back to China. In this case, they wanted to be confrontational with Canada. They wanted to know how far we would go, but I think we will gain some respect as a result.